Cheer up, it's a good Monday. And you're also saving 70 cents of fuel now. And the price went down last night or the day before. So my name is Daniel Lirango, the country leader at IPF. And I'm going to present a few insights on the report before we get a panel to help us discuss it further. All right, thank you. So in the next few minutes, I want to just premise our today's conversation with a few highlights of the media diagnostic. So that's just a complicated word to mean that we want to look at how the government has performed since we published our macro fiscal analytics snapshot in January. Look at our assumptions, critique them, look at the government assumptions and critique them even more, and allow ourselves to have a debate on where we stand at what looks like an inflection point of the Kenyans' public finances. So the brief report I'm going to present had a few issues we wanted to monitor at the start of the year, and we have been monitoring them, and we have a report on how things look like. One of those things is the revenue reforms that the government has instituted, and also the commitment to cutting unnecessary spending. We're also looking at the budget deficit, how much deficit we started with at the beginning of the year, and how much we ended up with by the close of the year in June 2025. We're also going to reflect on a very critical and abated conversation on social health insurance, otherwise known as SHIF, its implementation, and also the disbursement to counties, another rather complicated conversation that has been on our media and on our conversations. So what we are looking at to start with is how does our economy currently look like? The Kenya's macroeconomic performance, it was very optimistic at the start of the year. Many institutions, including ourselves, had indicated or projected a growth of about 5%. Across the year, we were proven wrong because many things were not working as they should. One of the things that reduced our optimism is the initial withdrawal of the June 2024 finance bill and the subsequent tax laws that were introduced at the end of last year that, as we'll see, have not led to any significant increase in revenue. The other bit was the early withdrawal of the Kenyan government from the IMF program, which signaled something to investors, it signaled something to foreign investors, domestic investors, and anyone who would be interested in doing business in Kenya. It meant something. We'll also look at what happened during the political unrest and the effect it had in our economy. So IMF, Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, ourselves adjusted the economic growth to, sort of reflect a better reality. You look at the beginning of the year, we had projected 5.1% growth, but currently the projections are at about 4.8, and for others it's around 4.5. In June of this year, the World Bank has projected that will grow even by less percentage points. So, and to restore this optimism, to restore the economy back to the 5% growth and above, what needs to happen? We have a few insights on what the government needs to do. First is investing in sectors that build resilience, that protect the vulnerable, and that sustain the economy. One of those sectors is the sector of education, which has one of the greatest multiplier, which also has a better equity perspective in the long run, that anyone who has an opportunity to go to school has a better future, has better opportunity to secure their own future. The other sector is in health. And health has, in two ways. One is to reduce the amount of out-of-pocket spending that households spend on health, and also to ensure that people are healthy enough to be able to be productive and to produce and be active in the economy, in building the economy. So that is generally how the economic indicators look like. On revenue reforms and commitments to cut expenditures, this is where we see some bit of inconsistent policy pronouncement. At the beginning of last year, the financial year 2024-2025, you remember after the withdrawal of the finance bill, the government cut down the budget by around 122 billion in what was called Supplementary Budget 1, which is a provision of Article 223 of the Constitution, that adjustments can be made when necessary on the budget within the year, even after the approval by the National Assembly. So what happened is their budget was revised downward, the expenditure was revised downward by 122 billion in the first supplementary. But at the close of the financial year, that is June of this year, close to the close of the year, the budget had increased again further, and by around 67 billion or thereabout. The fiscal deficit increased because the revenue was revised downward, as we see here. The revenue was revised downward from 2.7 trillion to around 2.5 or 2.3 trillion. But still, even then, at the close of the year, we missed the target by 67 billion. So our fiscal deficit, the difference between how much we spent and how much we collected in revenue, was about 999 billion, which is almost a trillion. So what does that do? As the topic of today suggests, is a debt overshoot. We have to borrow more. Sorry. We have to borrow more to finance the budget expenditure. You look at the figures on the right, that has been going up. If you see that blue graph has been going up, but on the left, that has been going down. So that is the main reason of the fiscal deficit. Right. This. Can you hear me? All right. I hope you could hear me earlier. All right. So now we are looking at after the withdrawal of the finance bill last year, there was some piecemeal commitments towards fiscal consolidation. There are some commitments that were outlined by the government on how they are going to increase the trust between citizens and the government, how they are going to restore confidence on our public finance, and how we are going to bridge the gap between our revenue and our spending without necessarily increasing the taxes. One of the things that had been committed was to dissolve 47 state corporations with overlapping mandates and functions. That unless it was achieved before this report, it had not been achieved then. And the update I have, it has not been achieved even today. The other one was to suspend Chief Administrative Secretary positions, the CAS. Done or not done? Was done, right? Then there was the reduction of the number of advisors by 50%. I think it went up by that figure, if I'm not wrong. Then the budget for office of the First Lady and the Deputy Prime Cabinet Secretary, I believe that was done. Remove budget provisions for confidential budget in the Executive Office. That was not done, and that would be the case for all the rest. Reduction of budgets for renovations by 50%. Have you seen the recent updates on the State House? Suspend purchase of new motor vehicles except for security agencies. Your guesses are good than mine on that one. Suspend non-essential travel by state officers. Propose to Parliament a budget cut of 177 billion instead of 346 billion that the 2024 finance bill targeted. It was done initially, but at the close of the year, as I've said, this had gone up again to increase the deficit by almost $1 trillion shillings. Then banning participation of officers from contributions in Harambes. Now there's a different angle to this, I think empowerment or something. So we are not there yet. So looking at the initial commitments to fiscal consolidation, we believe the government has a lot that begs to be done, given that these commitments were supposed to pursue austerity measures, and most of them are not yet achieved. Now, a bigger conversation is even happening at the county level. Counties depend on national government transfers, most of them of upwards of 90% of their resources. 90% of their budget is funded by the national exchequer, the disbursements from the national government. So, but at the close of the 9 months, by the time we're publishing this report, the final report was not out, but at the 9-month mark, which is April of this year, there was only 58% that had disbursed, with only 3 months to go. So this included 225 billion, but we do not account for the 30 billion that was arrears the previous year. Now, this money that counties don't spend before the close of the year, it is not immediately accessible, even at the opening of the next year. So, for instance, you will imagine, because the expenditure was you'll imagine, because the expenditure was something is going on. Yes, that the expenditure was 30-40 billion less before the close of the year, that money is immediately accessible at the opening of the next financial year. So you close the year by 30th June and 1st of July, that money is immediately accessible. That is not the case. So what happens is, even some money carried forward, counties can only access them in the second quarter. This has also affected operations in the counties, increase in pending bills, increase in the resource gaps, and so compromising service delivery as it should be. Now, looking at the fiscal, are the slides moving on the side? They are moving from here, so I don't know. So, right, in the interest of time, let me just move forward. First is to say that there's what the government calls the primary fiscal deficit, which is the revenue minus expenditure, and this expenditure does not include interest payments on debt. So that primary fiscal balance, fiscal balance should be around 2% of the GDP. It should be a surplus of 2% of the GDP, but we are currently at -4, which is a deficit of the GDP. So this explosion in debt interest payments And the disproportionate growth in revenue is very crucial because the government has to cut back on non-priority spending if we are going to achieve the primary fiscal deficit, which currently stands at stands at a deficit of 4%, and we need to go up to 2%. Now, this does not stop here. So the reason why we are emphasizing that the government need to look at the expenditure side of the budget is because starting from 2028, the next decade, there will be at least 1 trillion payment on amortization and interest to up to 2036 on maturing Eurobonds. So these are the highest. The highest is 1 trillion between 2028 and 2036. But in between, there are also very significant payments that need to be made by the government. So if you're paying 1 trillion every year, and in a good case scenario, say for instance this year, which has been I think one of the highest revenue collection of about 2.4 trillion in ordinary revenue, then it means that for every shilling collected, we are going to spend relatively above 60% of that in repayment of debt. And if you look at what comes ahead of that is the aggressive domestic borrowing. The private sector is being crowded out. Over the last couple of months, the CBK has reduced the interest rates, but the amount of the rate of interest on private loans is still sticky. It is not going down. Why? Because the government is a more attractive borrower from the banks. And the domestic debt has been very, very extremely aggressive. Because it has high yields, the premiums are good, the government is more secure. So there is no incentive for the banks, the private banks, to lend to the private sector. Compounding that problem is the pending bills. There was a declaration to clear pending bills, all that had been approved. And what we are seeing is between last year, 2024, and this year, 2025, the pending bills have increased from 639 billion to 684 billion. This is forced lending by the private sector from the government. The amount at the county level has increased by around 20 billion, and at the national level has increased by more than 70 billion. So why do banks prefer to lend to the government, more than the private sector? I wish you'd be seeing this. You would see the growth in credit to the government has been increasing in the last 6 months, from October 2024 up to around March 2025 when we are monitoring this. Comparatively, the credit to the private sector has been going down. In the same period, it's reduced significantly, meaning it's obvious that the government is a more preferable lender than the private sector. So that's why the economic growth has been so sticky, because the private sector operations have minimized. There's money owed to the private sector by the government in terms of pending bills, and most of those small and medium enterprises are no longer in operation because they are unable to sustain this kind of economic or other business environment. Finally, on SHA and SHIF and its implementation in 2025. First is what we saw a few months ago, that similar to the problems that faced NHIF, there are still major governance and accountability issues in the way remittances are made to health facilities. There are delayed payments because, as the report that was published in May showed that 75% of level 3 to level 5 facilities are the only one that received shift payments, and from that figure, 83% of them received less than half of what they are owed. So this has been affecting the operations of facilities and then also compromising the delivery of health services. If you look also at the registration of SHIF, it has about 22 million registered members, but only 4 million are contributing. Those are the people who are formally employed. So the health system of this country is running on the back of 4 million people. I don't think that's the best way to deliver universal health coverage. We are currently doing about 50% of what is required as a per capita investment on every individual to achieve universal health coverage. The method of means testing that was rolled out by SHA has also been having very many inaccuracies, in determining contribution for the informal sector. And this has been a major complaint as we have had. There has been a very prolonged strike by the UHC health workers who are supposed to be absorbed by the county governments, and some budget allocation was made towards that to ensure that counties absorb these health workers. So what are we saying in conclusion? First is that the macro fiscal analysis that we've done reveals a widening gap between the stated policy intentions and the actual implementation. I think if for nothing else, if you forget everything else about SHA, this is what the major takeaway is. The policy intentions are there, but there is a bigger gap in implementing and executing them. So what does the government need to do? There are a number of things we submit here, and the panel will discuss them in greater detail. One of them is to implement predictable reforms. In this sense, we mean if the government commits to, say, clearing all pending bills, as a private business person, I should be confident that the government will pursue that, and it will honor its obligation to clear any pending bills. If we say that the fiscal deficit would be 4% of the GDP, the expectations of households that need to plan or private sector that need to invest is that they will not outcompete them in borrowing from the banks, the domestic commercial banks. Then also anchor fiscal decisions in public participation. This has been more so in the system, the different system, the procurement system, the SHA systems. There are always a new system every day in the government procurement systems that has been challenged, that it has not undergone public participation. The biggest one is the one in the SHA system. Also, the other thing is accelerating pending bills clearance and safeguarding health sector investment to make sure that we protect the vulnerable. Finally, is the reduction on over-reliance on consumption taxes, the VATs, and the like. So in most progressive countries, they invest more on income-oriented taxes, But in income-oriented taxes, this is where we have the huge tax expenditure in our country. We are foregoing revenue of upwards of 400 billion every year, on the pretext that we are going to spur economic growth, we are going to create more jobs, but we need to evaluate these tax expenditures against the policy objectives that they're supposed to pursue. In doing that, maybe we'll be able to bridge the fiscal gap, but that in itself cannot be sufficient. I will invite our panelists to reflect on these issues because I don't have enough time to go deeper, but they'll speak about them as we proceed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, our country lead, Daniel Rango. for triggering the buttons for us and triggering those light bulb moments so that we now get into the flesh and clear perspective from our esteemed panelists on the reflections, on the findings, and most importantly, to ask ourselves, what do we need to do? In policy conversation, one very important thing that we need to always carry forward is that the policy insights, the conversations that we raise should be irritable, so irritable that we cannot ignore them. We need to have credible arguments on what policy actions and reforms we need to do. So credible and very solid and backed by citizen voices, backed by evidence, backed by thought out analysis, so that as we advance this reform, then we are able to see substantive change. I will welcome my colleague, Veronica Ndeba, who will take us through the panel discussion. Good morning. Let's show you if it's working. And it's my name is Veronica Ndeba. Okay. Maybe I can get a different one. It's actually on. Can someone confirm it's working at the back? Yes. From the mic? Yeah. Oh. Probably I have big lungs, like Moses had. So I'll be moderating today's panel and just reflecting on the presentation that has been made. At IPF, we usually say our mission is to see all values of public principles of public finance realized. But I think if what we've seen from the presentation is to continue, then IPF will be around for a very long while. The presentation has cast light on some of the challenges that we are facing as a country. We've seen that our growth numbers have been revised downwards. The fiscal deficit keeps widening because of revenue shortfalls and ever-growing public expenditures. The Kenya's debt to GDP ratio is above its anchor of 55% in net present value terms. And as even the debt grows, we have large payments scheduled on Eurobonds and other debt, including domestic debt that keeps growing. In terms of our policy framework, we see great persistent non-compliance with Article 223 in passing supplementary budgets, and there are concerns around debt sustainability because of our increased borrowing. And this, as highlighted by Daniel, risks crowding out the private sector. And from the growth numbers in terms of credit extended to the private sector, there's much higher growth in terms of lending to the government and a decline in credit to the private sector. As IPF, we try as much as possible to give policy alternatives to what the government is proposing, and this is what I hope my panel will do today. Mine is to ask the questions. I hope they are not hard. And my first panelist is our former PS at the National Treasury, Dr. Julius Muya, FCS. He has a very good and lengthy profile. I'll try to go through it quickly. FCS, FCPA, Dr. Julius Muya, CBS, is currently the public sector lead at Anderson, a consulting and tax advisory firm. His area of specialization is finance and public policy. Prior to joining Anderson in 2023, Dr. Muya served as the principal secretary at the National Treasury of Kenya, where he was responsible for coordinating and budgeting function, macroeconomic policy, mobilizing grant and debt finance, among others. This role also involved providing leadership in climate finance, as well as conceptualizing and implementing innovative reforms in policy institutional, regulatory, and legal space. Dr. Muya has therefore extensive experience in public policy and economic planning. He is a regular speaker on various topics and subjects, and that's why we invited him here today. Dr. Julius Muya, kindly join us on stage. My colleague, Meshach, will guide you on where to sit. I think you should sit on where the cameras are focusing more. The second panelist is Andrew. Andrew Kugo is a seasoned public finance expert with over 15 years of leadership in Kenya's public sector, specializing in public financial management, fiscal policy, and budget reforms to drive accountability and revenue growth. He is an FCCA and CPAK certified professional. He has spearheaded transformative initiatives, including serving as the county executive for finance in Taita Taveta. He's currently a PhD candidate with a focus on tax justice and climate responsive budgeting. Andrew, please join us on stage. She did not introduce herself, but I have her profile here. Ms. Ruth Kendagor is the third panelist. She's an economist and a public finance expert with a passion for good governance and policy leadership. She champions fiscal transparency, prudent debt management, and revenue reforms that works to build partnerships that drive co-created, evidence-based policy solutions in Kenya and beyond. Ms. Ruth Kendagor is the Director, Global Partnerships at IPF. Welcome, Ruth. I also need to be directed on where to sit. Thank you, Nisha. And you can have my right. I'll pass the to Dr. Julius here. And I think given the presentation, we see that better institutions are raising our growth downward. So probably given the expertise in this space, you can tell us what you feel on Kenya's macro fiscal outlook and what are some of the policy actions that would grow confidence in the economy of the future.
Thank you, for that question. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Let me respond to what asked presented to me and really to appreciate what I hear from organization. And also to appreciate Daniel for that very good presentation. For we need for the good. So when we get a chance to have some but dealing with the questions that are raised, one about what is our prospect and given the protection. And normally when you look at the various that show their focus on, so there's usually some very close convergence, but not complete agreement in terms of 100%. So 4.5, 4.8, 4.7%. I would say the projections are fairly faithful in terms of where we are likely to see the economy going. And if you look at that, those of us who are we can even look back maybe 10 years ago. Every year or every quarter of the year, we do this kind of like various. So how far do those projections go in terms of now being indicated? And unless something happens very, very unexpected, usually the projections are not very fast. So I see the economy growing more or less in the same region, 4.5, 4.8%. As is projected And I say so because one of the fortunate things that we have is that we have very credible data from our NGOs in terms of what is used to generate those projections, to generate those numbers in terms of where the economy is. Also, our economy is quite diverse. Unlike some economies where they rely on maybe one or two commodities, in which case a small change in a fundamental aspect, either sector or some wow event, usually causes a big problem at each point. In our case in Kenya, because of the diversification of the economy, we don't have that big risk of the economy kind of like growth shifting because of just one factor. Obviously, we rely a lot on rainfall, but to the extent that the rain can be sympathetic to us, I see that is a good anchor in terms of saying the economy will grow in the region that it has. So, my conclusion on that is that we are safe that the starting 4.5% unless something really the COVID happened, full thing, the COVID happened. So, we pray that nothing is tragic. Now, you did ask me about some politics that in the public economy. How they are doing. Of course, there are very many, but let me just pick up. And one of them, and I was making notes as something was so one of them that I think very quickly is the issue of right. And there are a lot of nomenclature, a lot of words that we can use for this. So when I was in the public, we spoke about fiscal consolidation, where you reduce the budget deficit very proactively and also reduce the accumulation of debt. But also you go ahead and address something called the money, where you're looking at the maturity profile of the debt, you're looking at the cost of the debt, and then you are looking at how the repayment of the debt will be made and what is the risk which is underlying. So if we can very, very proactively focus on fiscal consolidation so that it is not just a pronunciation of a number, that sometimes then we look for reasons where we cannot achieve it. If we can proactively deal with liability management, in terms of the profile of our debt, in terms of the cost of something or debt, in terms of the debt, that can help a lot. And that can be probably not where money comes out of the banks and is given to government support, so that government can then finance with budget. So that's the one recommendation that I would make in terms of the policy. The second one that I would recommend would be looking at the issue of budgeting well. Because the way Daniel did present the numbers here, it was very clear that budgets of government and government expenditure has taken behavior. You know, you have numbers that are thrown in there and getting them out is very. If you look at the austerity measures here, I think a quick count. There were about 10 lines of austerity measures. Can you remember how many of those 10 lines were achieved? There were 2. So in our simple maths, what is the achievement rate? 2 divided by 10, 20%, right? Because government expenses something that you always budget for before, you keep on budgeting for it, even when the reason for that budget. So I would say focusing on capital expenditure, focusing on revenue expenditure, and by the way, and I want to say this because the electronic government procurement system is one very tried and tested method and tool that has been used globally to deal with controlling government expenditure for what we call common user for goods, services, and public works. It is something that is tried and tested and that can be used in government expenditure. The third item that I would mention, it is something that Daniel also mentioned, and it did indicate that there is a gap between the policy invention and what then tends to happen. And that is the animal, which I would call the area of how government delivers what it intends to deliver in terms of policy, and how government delivers projects. And that is the area of monitoring and evaluation. Very, very clear monitoring and evaluation to test and make sure that you've got indicators before any policy has been pronounced. You've got indicators for any project so that we can do a proper monitoring and evaluation. I think that's an area where we can benefit a lot if there's a big policy reform around that. There are many others that I can say, but for the time being, thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing one, and I think we have recommendations that will also inform our next week. We come to those again sticking to the issue of projections, but this time around projections. And in financial year 2024-2025, we saw the government revise revenue target at least 3 times and still missed the revenue target. And yet we have seen some revenue reforms since the government, the current government is reformed. So could you tell us where the government is going wrong in its fiscal projections and its tax policy reforms? And when responding to that,
thank you very much, Veronica. Indeed, as Dr. Muya has mentioned, the credibility of the systems that we leverage on to inform public policy and policy decisions has been stable, yes, but there is room to improve further. Now, specifically with regard to revenue projection, within the financial year 2024, the year that ended June 30 this year, we saw the revenue projection being revised up until the point of supplementary budget at the end of financial year, moving from a target of 2.9 to 2.4 trillion. But if you look back in the past, in the previous year, missing the revenue target is not something new. It's not something that we can credit or say this was a particular instance or an outlier within the financial year 2024. Over the past almost 10 years, our budgeting system and our financial planning has always shown that we have missed our target. And notably, the gap between the target and the action has been growing. Revenue generation and revenue collection has been growing, yes, but the gap between the target and the action has also been growing. Around 2012, our revenue gap, or the gap between the target and the action was around 30 to 50 billion. Now we are looking at something 70, 80, close to 100. So it is more than just the shocks that came with the citizen uprising and the rejection of the finance in 2024. There is more, a bigger and a deeper systematic issue that needs to be addressed. Why are we seeing this shock? Number one, our assumptions when we're making revenue projections are not always materialized. So government needs to look back at the assumptions, at the projections, the fundamentals that inform the projections that we made so that they're realistic. One of the things PSME has mentioned is the growth in the private sector. We have always put quite some emphasis on the private sector growth that we intended that growth relates or realized into revenue collection, but that has not been the case. Secondly, the frequent changes in tax laws contributes to uncertainty that is not harmful to the economy. And this has been discussed several times. Last year, we had the medium-term revenue strategy. The intention of the MTRS was to provide that stability in terms of revenue reform, so that business people, citizens, investors can have an outlook, a 3 to 5 year outlook on what to expect in terms of revenue reforms, and therefore create some sense of stability and predictability. But what we have seen is that the revenue target, the actual implementation of the revenue strategy has not really been followed to the letter. And so the concerns of uncertainty and lack of predictability still holds. And thirdly, as a response to that also, is the issue of revenue leakage. Our projections may have some credibility, but the leakages in the system still exist. Leakages starting from tax exemptions, and the current system, our tax exemptions are about 500 billion, which is a significant amount, literally that's double what we spend on the health sector, providing health coverage for our country. So we need to look at this revenue leakage, so that as we're making exemptions, then we ensure that we're making revenue projections for what we want to collect, but also sealing the loopholes that lead to slippages or leakages of the revenue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Predictable tax environment as well as addressing the problem of taxation. So coming to you, Andrew, sticking to the question of reforms. And this question was targeted to you, at you, intentionally. And I think over the past few years, we have seen citizens being more informed, both on the kind of budgeting the government is doing and as well as the tax reforms. And as Ruth mentioned, the 2024 protest around the finance bill was a good example of an informed citizen. So the question is, how can the government better design its reforms to balance Kenya's fiscal needs, because we do have fiscal needs, including debt service, and while also being acceptable to the citizen.
Thank you. You brought me back to the issue of the Gen Z person, and I think it came at the right time. Why do I say so? Because we put the government in the spot that something is not one. Can you listen to us as a citizen? So what does that tell us? We have a citizenry that is well monitored. The surprise, most of the people who are active in terms of demanding more, in terms of the government policies, are people who are just coming from college, university. These are people who have gone through the free education system. So you find they have the knowledge. Then two, we cannot run away from the fact that we live in a technological era where information is available at the palm of your hands, just by your phone. You can do a short analysis of what is happening. So once government understands that, then now we start coining and framing our policies towards that. Now, first and foremost, for me, I think having looked at it, I would suggest, or I would tell the government that it is now mandatory for us to embed public participation, or if we may put it that way, public participation in budget formulation and tax policy. That one needs to happen now. I know we have a bill in Parliament concerning issues to do with public participation. I'm not so sure whether it is an act, hopefully, because it would have laid down a framework of how the citizens are involved. So what you may call public participation is not public participation. I can comprehend what is, say, in a tax, in a finance act bill, finance act, or even the budget. I can understand it, but who caters for the mwananchi back in my rural area, say in the far-flung area like Turkana? So how are we bringing them on board? See, so the government now needs to look at that. How are we going to communicate our policies to our citizens? That is number one. They have to do that. So they have to find a way.
And in doing that, they also have to bring in the element of technology. ICT ministry now has, for me, I look at it as an open forum for them to use all available forms of media, social media, and what have you, to communicate. That's how you bring in the citizens so that they can own some of these things. Then number two, even as we look at how we're going to engage the citizens, let's also talk about having progressive tax policies. I think my panelists have talked about it. We need to know. You see, it is very strange when you wake up prior to 2024. We woke and then we're told now there's a housing levy that will be passed. Not in your budget. You know, when I wake up, I go to work, I know at the end of the month I expect to receive this. Then all of a sudden you're hit with the housing levy. All of a sudden you're hit with SHA. All of a sudden, so all these changes bring uncertainty, and this uncertainty now rattles the public. So let's have a tax policy that is, predictable, something that we can sit down and say, okay, why don't we monitor it for the next 2-3 years? What has been the shortfall? How do we now look at, say, the leakages? Something that we can comprehend, understand, and we can follow through. If we get that, then I think the government now will be doing it well. Then the third thing, communication. I cannot stress that more than enough. The government is not communicating with the citizen. Unfortunately, that is what is happening. That's why, as someone who really did analysis of the finance Act 2024, there were a lot of good things in it. How did the government communicate? They failed to communicate. So, as someone who probably is looking at housing levy, I would wake up and shout and say, no, this one, no. But you see, the government needs to adopt a much more citizen-centered communication where we communicate openly and tell them, you know what, why we're bringing this is because we want to achieve 1, 2, 3. This tax we're collecting, how are we spending the tax? Let's have open forums whereby we have candid and open discussions. And once we do that, then I do believe that even bringing in new policies or coming up with new frameworks for the government, it will be very easy for them because they have communicated, they have taken in the citizens' perceptions about it. It's more or less of an interaction. But until then, I don't know. Maybe we'll experience more of these unsettled citizens and what.
Okay, thank you. Effective public participation anchored on effective communication. So coming back to you, Dr. Muya, you spoke about liability management, and this is in the context of managing our public debt better. So my question is, should debt restructuring be part of the conversation around liability management? And secondly, we have seen the government shifting, I call it creative, quote unquote, borrowing approaches, such as securitization. In responding to that question, you can tell us what securitization is and the fiscal risks that it presents.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Oh, lovely, thank you. That's it. No, we'd like to change the mic. This one I give away. Okay, this is better. So going back to the first question, and I think the big question is not just about liability management. What I was reading as Veronica was going through the question, by the way, how much time do I have? I have 3 minutes to convince you. So this is a big subject actually, which can take me quite a while. But let me try to rush through in the 3 minutes that I have. And so I think the elephant in the room is restructuring. I think that's the question I've been asked. In terms of the implications, when we talk about restructuring, it is something that you only do when you are unable to
service your debt, as is the case in the public sector. Now, that is something that is not very, very welcome. And countries that submit themselves to restructuring would be countries in debt distress, not with high risk of debt distress, like is the case for Kenya. And restructuring can take very, very many forms, postponing the payment of debt as it comes due, changing the interest rates, haircuts, yeah, thank you very much, Mheshimiwa, haircuts, and also could be reorganizing the maturity profile, I said about delaying payments and so on and so forth. So it is something that you don't just rush into it. But there's a better way of dealing with public debt other than submitting yourself to restructuring. And it is the situation and the right nomenclature, and thank you, Veronica, for using that word, is liability management. And here, you are looking at an active and a proactive stance in terms of looking at the maturity profile of your public debt. You are looking at your cost of debt. You are looking at the repayment program that you have on your debt, and you are looking to make sure that you've got the lowest cost for your debt. You are looking to make sure that your risk of debt, kind of like default on the payment, is minimized as much as possible. But at the same time, that exercise must also be anchored on ensuring that you are providing enough finance for the government to finance its both capital and revenue expenditure. And so I want to say, thankfully, there are a lot of tools that are available for active liability management. And that is something that if a government prioritizes it, there are very good examples of how various governments, and I can quote some examples in Africa, Benin, Seychelles, Senegal, Rwanda. I mean, these are countries that have been involved in very active liability management and have been able to significantly reduce their cost of debt. In fact, I do submit here that when those countries issue Eurobonds, they are able to issue Eurobonds at a lower cost than Kenya. And that is because of very active liability management. So I think on the liability management and the question about restructuring, I have done a bit of justice. Now, the question about securitization, this is a long debate. And looking at it just straight from the word securitization, it relates to either assets or revenues, where an institution has got a pool of assets, and that pool of assets, then you structure them in a way such that you can sell them to investors through what is called an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, which is created so that you transfer those assets to that special purpose vehicle, and it is that special purpose vehicle which manages the assets so that the returns from the assets can be used to pay the investors who have given you the money. So that is on the asset side. And you can think about assets in Kenya that can be put in such a vehicle. But I think what is being asked today here is the securitization of revenues, where you've got future cash flows. Like for instance, I think the best example would be like the road maintenance levy, RML, where you've got a predictable income stream and you know that in the next so many years, this is how much you'll be collecting in terms of road maintenance levy. And so instead of waiting for those years for the money to come in through the levy, then you organize and package that revenue in a way such that you transfer the revenues and the rights to the revenues to a special purpose vehicle that you create. And so that when the road maintenance levy is collected in future years, instead of it coming to the institution in government that receives it, it goes now to that special purpose vehicle that has been created. Now, If you look at it, there are, okay, the word Veronica used, innovative, yeah. There is an innovation around it, because you are saying rather than wait until 10 years to get this accumulated revenue from road maintenance, let me get the money now.